Today we are going to discuss what are properties, why we need properties, what are the different types of properties, what is the advantages of using properties. If we are not using properties, then what are the problem we will get. Each properties is available in other programming languages like C++ and Java. If property is not available in other programming language, then how this functionality they implement in their programming languages like. So all these things we are going to discuss in today's session. So simply let us first understand why do we need properties. See, what is our intention? See, whenever we are developing our application to perform some operation, what we need? We need some data. We need some values, right? And to store the data and to store the value, what we are using generally, we are using variables. So in our application, okay, so in our application, if you look at the example, right? So this is one class, right, student. And if you want to hold the ID, or if you want to hold the name, and if you want to hold the password, then what you need? You need some variables like this. So ID, name, password, these are nothing but one variable, and variable are going to hold the value. Even variable is there to hold the value, then why we need properties? That is what we need to understand, right? To encapsulate and to protect the data member. So whenever I'm saying data member, it means you can consider fields or variables. Field or variable are nothing but the same alternative name. So if I'm saying underscore ID, it's a field, or you can say it's a variable. Name, it's a field, or you can say it's a variable. And password, it's a field, or you can say it's a variable. See, here I'm starting with the special character underscore. This is acceptable. Why? Because as per our guideline, naming convention, a identifier can start with a special character called underscore. So here you can say I'm starting with a special character underscore. So these are variables, and these variables are going to actually hold the data. But if you want to protect the data, right? Protect the data, then you need properties, right? So how to protect the data and how properties will protect the data, that we will discuss. But the two things you need to understand: variable is there to hold the data, properties is there to protect the data. So if you are using properties, it means variable should be there. Without variable, property is useless. Why? Because why? Because see, if value is not there, if data is not there, then properties will protect whom? Properties will protect data. Data should be there. Then how we are going to hold the data in our application? We are going to hold the data in our application using three fields or variable. So variable should be there. Once variable is there, variable is going to hold the data, and we are using the concept properties to protect those data which is held by the variable, right? So is that clear?
Yes, yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, now another thing that you need to know. Properties are used as a mechanism to set and get the values of a data member of a class outside of the class. See, this is a class. This is one class student, and this is another class program. And if you want to set and get the values of these properties, then you need to use, sorry, if you want to set and get the values of these fields, or you can say data members, or you can say variables, you need properties. Why? See, if I'm declaring these things as a private, then private means this should only be available within this class code. Outside of the class, you cannot access these private data members. If you want to access these private data members outside the class accessing means whether for setting the value or for getting the value, then you need properties. So what exactly properties? Properties is a medium of communication. Properties are basically used to transfer the data, right? So basically it is used to transfer the data. So the properties mechanism to set or get the values of data members of a class outside of the class. If a class contains any values in it, if you want to access those values outside of the class, we can provide access to the values in two different ways. See, if your variable having some value, and if you want to access this value outside of the class, then you can access these values in two different ways. By storing the value under a public variable. See. So what, how? Now, if I make this as public, then I can access this. See. If you make the variable as public, then you can access the variable. So this is one of the way. By storing the value under a public variable, we can give direct access to the value outside of the class. By storing that value in a private variable, we can also give access to that variable outside of the class by defining a property for that variable. Even you can give access to this. Suppose name property is there. Now I'm going to declare a property, right? So I'm going to declare a name property, and using this name property, I can also access and I can also set and get the value of this name variable, right? How, that we will discuss, right? How we'll set and get the name, that we will discuss. But for now, just understand. So we can access the data member of a class outside of the class in two different ways, right? What are the different ways we can access? By using a public variables or by using public properties. See here student ID. So ID is a property, and here student name. Here ID is a variable, and here name is a property. So you can access the data member or the values from one class outside the class by using either variable or by using either property. But the thing is that if I'm using property, this property is never meant for storing the data. You cannot store data using the property, right? This is the property. Property are special method having getter and setter accessor. They are not meant for storing the data. They are just used for transferring the data. Suppose in this case, I will come to that point practically. But for now, just remember, there are two ways to access the data of a class from outside the class. First, you can declare a public variable. Once you declare a public variable, then you can access the data directly. Even second thing is you can declare a private variable, and for that private variable, you can declare a public property, right? Public property. And using the private variable or public property, you can access the data members of a class from outside the class. We'll discuss this practically. If we make a variable as a private, then how this public property is going to set or get that value. That we'll see in practical now. So this is why we need properties. Properties means to protect the data. How it will protect the data? First of all, we need to make the data member, first of all, we need to make the field or variable as private. Once we make them as private, then we cannot access them directly. To access them from outside the class, what we will do? We'll create a public property for that variable, and that public property we can access from outside the class. And using that public property, we can set or get the private data member value, right? So what is exactly property? A property in CSharp is a member of a class which is used to set and get the data from a data field. So once you have a variable, that variable is going to hold the data. That is for sure. Properties is not going to hold the data. What is the role of a properties? Properties is basically used to set the data and get the data. If you want to set some data in a private data field, you can make use of a properties. Properties will take your data and will go to the private data field, and it will set the data. Properties will also get the data. Your private data field holds some data. Properties will take the data from the private data field and given to you from outside the class. So properties is meant for setting and getting the data field value. It is not meant for holding the data field value. The most important point that you need to remember is that a property is never used to store any data. It is just an interface or medium to transfer the data. We use properties as their public data members of class, but they are actually special method called accessors. So we are using this property as their public data member of a class, but actually they are not public data members. They are actually something called as a special method called accessors. Accessors means this method are having get accessors and they are having set accessor. We'll come to this point. What is get accessor and what is set accessor? Now, is there any question regarding what is a property?
No, sir.
Okay. Now the next point is what are accessors? The accessors are nothing but special methods which are used to set and get the values from the underlying data member. So these accessors are nothing but special methods which is basically used to set and get the value of the data member. Suppose this is a data member name, and if you want to set the value, then the set accessor is going to be used. If you want to get the value what is held by this name variable, then you can use get accessors to get the value. So accessor are nothing but special methods which are used to set and get the values from the underlying data member, that is variable of a class. Accessor are of two types, get accessor and set accessor. Now please observe this. What is set accessor? The set accessor is used to set the data, that is value, into a data field, that is a variable of a class. This set accessor contains a fixed variable called value. Whenever we call the property to set the data, whatever data value we are supplying, that will come and store inside the variable called value by default. Using set accessor, we cannot get the data. See, so basically, whenever you are using set accessor, you are going to use a fixed variable called value, and whatever value, suppose, so in this case, I'm passing this pranay. So this is the value, and this pranay value is going to be stored inside a fixed variable called value. So whenever you are using set accessor, this value variable is there, and whatever data you want to set, that data will be stored inside the value variable, and you can assign that data into the private data field. We'll see this practically. And what is the role of a get accessor? The get accessor is used to get the data from the data field, that is variable of a class, right? So let us understand this with an example. Okay. See, in my class, see, I am having two classes. One is employee class, another is program class. Program class means inside the program class, I want to access the employee class. So employee class, program class. Program class is outside of the employee class, right? And as it is outside, I have declared some private data members. So employee ID and employee name, these are two private data members. So as these are two private data members, you cannot access them directly from outside the class. See, here if I'm typing employee dot, so you can see employee name property is there, employee ID property is there. But did you see underscore employee ID? Did you see underscore employee name? No. These are not available to outside the class. Why it is not available? Because this is outside. And why as outside, and why it is not available to outside the class? Because these are private. So private member means they are only available within the local scope. So within the class scope means what you can access these private data members within this open and close curly braces. Outside of this open and close curly braces, you cannot access the private data, right? So then how we are accessing? And one more thing, these private data members are actually going to hold the data. If you want to store the ID, then this is the variable going to hold the data. If you want to store name, then this is the variable is going to hold the data. But as we are making these two are private, then we cannot access these two data member directly. Then how we will set the data and how we will get the data? Now for each private data member, we create a set of getter and setter methods. Sorry, yes, we can say we create some properties, right? So for this employee ID, I have created one property called EMP ID. So this employee ID property is basically used to set and get the data of this underscore employee ID variable. See, so this is a property. Syntax is this is access specifier, this is return type, and this is your property name. So while working with the property, you have to remember. So the property is created for which variable? This property is created for this employee ID variable. Then the most important thing that you need to remember is what is the data type of this variable? The data type should be same in this case. So this data type of this employee ID is integer, and while you are creating a property for this employee ID a variable, then you also need to make the property data type as int. Otherwise, it is going to give you error. So in this case, so as I mentioned you, so each property having two accessors. One is set accessor, another is get accessor, right? So set accessor is basically used to set the value into the variable, and get accessor is basically used to return the value from the variable. As I mentioned, so whenever you are going to set a value, you need to use a fixed variable called value. So what this fixed variable value is going to hold? Now in this case, whenever you are setting the value, here we are setting the employee ID. So employee.employee ID. So this is my value. So this 101 is going to be stored inside this variable. This fixed variable value will hold this 101 value. So, and then what I'm doing, I'm assigning that value to whom? I'm assigning that value to this private variable, right? So whenever this statement is executed, this 101 will come and sit in this variable, and that value we are assigning to this underscore employee ID variable, right? What is employee ID variable? It is a private data. It is a private data. It is a private variable inside the employee class. So using this public properties employee ID, we are setting the private employee ID variable value or not? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Then another variable is there. So each property having two accessors. Set accessor is meant for setting the value. Then what is the use of a get accessor? Get accessor is for returning the value or getting the value. So what it is returning? It is returning employee ID. So you can see this is the whatever value stored in this variable, that value will return when we use this property, right? So you can see this employee ID is not going to hold any data. So whatever value coming, right, that will come as part of this variable, and it will store the data inside the employee ID variable, and it is returning the data. What is employee ID holding? What value this employee ID holding? That it will return. Then you can see this is for setting the data, and this is for getting the data. If you are using equal and some variable, some value, that means it will be used for setting, and if you are only using the like this, then it is for getting the value. Similarly, now come to the second. So employee ID come. So employee name. See, first of all, you need to check what is the return type. What is the data type of this variable? The data type of this variable is string. You need to create a variable of string. So name is anything. You can give any name. Employee 1, 2, 3. You can give any name. That is not an issue, right? But the important thing is what is the return type. Return type should be same. If you are giving other return type, then it is not going to be work. For example, let's make this to integer. See, as soon as I make this integer, you will see some error. So cannot implicitly convert int to string. Cannot implicitly convert string to int, right? So you need to remember this. So data type of the variable should be same as the data type of the properties. The same thing. So this variable, this value variable, this is a fixed variable, and this variable fixed will hold the name, and it will assign that value to this variable, and similarly it will return the value what is held by this employee name variable, right? So get accessor is basically used to return the data, and set accessor is basically used to set the data, right? Is that clear?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Yes.
Okay. Now let's run the application and see the output. Okay, see, employee ID is that, employee name is this, right? So this is how you can consider. This is just an introduction to properties, but there are many things that we need to discuss as part of the properties. Okay, so I'm just creating an instance of the employee. See what this value is holding. This is holding 101. So whenever so this means this is setting the property, right? Setting the value. So setting the value. So setting the value means it will invoke the set accessor. So this set accessor currently employee ID 0, but what this value is holding 101. So that 101 will assign to this variable, right? Let's observe. So this statement is executed. Now you can see this is 101, and once this executed, this get accessor is not going to execute. See, and again this time the setter method of the employee name property is going to execute. See, it will set the employee name value. So this means the setter method of the setter accessor of the property is going to execute, and it will set the value of the private variable. Right now, in this case, the get accessor is going to be executed. So there is nothing to do. So I have not to give a breakpoint. Okay. Now, see, this statement is executed. So what is there in employee name pronoun? So that will be written and that will be displayed here. Is that clear? Is that clear?
Yes, sir. Sir, here I have a question.
Yeah,
In
ask.
this example, we have two variable. So
Yeah.
does its respective properties also hold the memory?
See, property doesn't hold any memory. So as I mentioned, who is going to store the data? Property or variable?
Variable.
So we need memory location. We need memory location for what purpose? To store the data? Yes or no?
Yes.
Then who is storing the data? Variable or properties?
Variable only.
Yeah, variable. Yeah.
So that means for the variable, memory allocation will be there. And what is this? These are nothing but you can consider method, right? So you are thinking that they are public data members, but they are not actually data members. They are actually method. Method doesn't have any memory allocation, right? Memory allocation is there for the variables only. And these method are basically used to set and get the data member, right? If you want to set some value, then they will going to set the value on this variable only. For properties, there is no memory allocation. Memory allocation is only for the private data member. Yeah, I can understand why you are asking me the question, because in your project you might be showing something like this, right? In your project, if you are working, then you will see this type of code. You will not see any kind of a private or a variable, right? So you are directly using properties like this. So this is auto-implemented property. So in this case, also some variable are there behind the scene. That will I will show you that practically. I will show you whether they are holding the data or the variables behind the scene for this property is going to hold the data. We'll come to that part. But I just give one introduction. What are properties? We'll discuss what are the different kinds of properties, everything. So properties are not going to properties doesn't have any memory allocation. Memory allocation is only for variables. And properties, it's just a medium of communication. It is just transferring the data from outside of the class to inside of the class, and it is just setting and getting the data of the private data. Okay.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah. So now you may have one question. Okay. Why not make the variables as a public? Why we are creating variables as a private, and why we are creating public properties for them, right? The answer is to achieve encapsulation. We'll discuss this detail when we discuss encapsulation principle, right? So you might be have one question, sir. Why we are creating this as a private? Kumar, you can't hear me. So guys, everyone, my voice is audible to all of you except Kumar.
Your voice is audible.
Yes.
Yeah. So Kumar, can you rejoin? Because it might be your problem or it might be some internet issues or something from your machine. Can you rejoin? Okay. If I have to store more than one value to same variable, how you can? See, this is not, this is a variable, right? Variable are meant for storing a single value at any point of time. So you cannot store two values to a single variable. You can do like this: employee ID equals to 100, employee ID equals to 102, right? But you cannot store more than one value at a time to a single variable. If you want to store more than one value, you can make use of arrays. And even if you want to see, this is means I'm creating one object. So this object means this is the information of a single student. single employee. So this is an employee object means this is an employee information. An employee having only one ID and one name. An employee cannot have more than one name, right? Or more ID. So if you want to create, if you want to store more than one employee information, you can create another employee. You can create another employee and you can store the name and ID like this, right? But using a variable, you can store only a single value. You cannot store more than one value. For storing more than one value under a single variable name, we have the concept called array. We have the concept called collection that we'll discuss in our, once you start discussing collection framework, we'll discuss, right? But for now, variable means you can hold a single value only. You can update the value. Each time you update, the old value will be lost. But at any point of time, you can store a single value. Can we use array with properties? See, array is a different story altogether, right? And properties are altogether a different story. We will come to that part when we'll discuss array. Because if I'm explaining the concept right now, you will having not one or two questions, you will having many questions. Before that, we need to understand the basic concept, right? First of all, we need to understand array. We need to understand property. What are the different kind of a properties? What is a class? How to create an array, right? And then I will discuss you how to store more than properties, right? So it's a property. So you can store now. So if you want to store, then you can store property with array. That will come. That will discuss once you start discussing the array concept, right? For now, we are just going to give you an introduction to property. And see this. Now we are only discussing the basic part. Basic part means what are these and how you can use them. And once we move forward, once you start discussing the advanced concept, then we are going to use this thing only in the advanced concept. Today I discuss property. Property is going to be used every time. We have discussed data type. We have discussed operator, right? We have discussed variable, and we are now discussing this property. So these things are going to be used in almost all the application or all the concept that we are going to discuss going further. So these are the basic thing now we are going to discuss. So there are basically 4 types of properties available in CSharp: read only, write only, read write, and auto implemented property. Now the read only property is used to read the data from the data field. Okay, let me explain you with practically. So read only property is basically is the property which is used to read the data, right? Suppose I remove this set accessor, right? If I remove this set accessor, you will get one error here. Why? Because now employee ID is a read only properties. Using this read only property, you cannot set the. Now, if I remove this get accessor from this property, right? If I remove this get accessor from this property, then what it will become? It will become a set accessor. So using set accessor, you cannot get the data, right? So read only property means having only get accessor, and write only property means having only set accessor. If your property having only set accessor, it means it's a write only property. And using write only property, you cannot read the data. If your property having only get accessor, means it's a read only property. Read only property means you cannot set the data. And even if you want, and if your property having both getter and setter, right? And if your property having both getter and setter, now this property having both setter accessor and getter accessor, if the property having both getter and setter accessor, then it's going to be a read write property. Is that clear? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
So it is optional. If you want, you can create the property using both getter and setter. If you want, you can create the property with only getter method. And if you want, you can create the property with only setter method. It is up to you. But the point that you need to remember, if your property having only get accessor, means it is only used for returning the data. You cannot use this property to set the data. And if your property having only set accessor, means you can only set the data. You cannot return the employee name from outside the class. That is the point that you need to remember. Now let us see some example. Now let us understand this read write property, read and write property. Okay. Already we have discussed the examples, but let me explain you. Okay. So I'm having employee ID is employee name and address, and I'm having this employee ID having both read and write properties. Age is also having write and read properties. This is also having read property as well as write property, and this is also having read property as well as write property. This variable, this value is nothing but a fixed value, and this fixed value, whenever you are setting the address property, so what value you are setting, that value will store in this variable, and that value will be assigned to this private address variable. And the same in the case of employee ID, in the case of age, and in the case of employee name. See, here I'm declaring employee ID and age as integer data type. So you can see employee ID data type is int, and age variable age property data type is also int. Now from outside the class, I'm just creating an instance. I'm creating then I'm setting these properties, right? Employee ID name, and guys, here you can see 3 dotted mark. So what it means, it is suggesting that you can simplify the object initialization. So how? Now instead of separating this initialization from this declaration part, you can initialize with the same in the same declaration. So you can do this like also. So there is no difference. So in this case, whatever now while creating the object, I'm initializing the data members. And previously what I'm doing, now in previously what I'm doing, I'm creating the instance separately and I'm initializing the data member separately. Instead of this creation and initialization two part. See, if you want to understand this, you can declare one integer variable like this. It is acceptable. Even if you want, then you can do the same thing like this now. So here what I'm doing, I'm declaring one variable and initializing the variable. That means two statement. Here I'm declaring the variable and I'm initializing the variable. If you could do like this, declaration and initialization at the same line, even the same thing is also available with reference type. So the declaration and initialization are the same statement. There is no difference between the previous one and this one. Now, if you run this application, then you will see the output as expected in the console. Let's run the application and see the output. But the thing that you need to remember, this ID name and okay. So ID name, age, and address, whatever we are setting the value that we are getting. But the point that you need to remember is you cannot access the private data members. So see, these are your private data members. This underscore variable, underscore employee ID name, right? You cannot access from outside the class, right? Okay, let's see. So now, if I'm writing the variable name employee, this is, and if I'm pressing enter, the intelligence will only showing these 4 properties: address, age, employee ID, and the name. But it is not showing the variables. So variables are started with the underscore in our class. Is there anything which is started with the underscore? No. That means what? Now it means if you create something as private, then that is not going to be available from outside the class. Even if you make any properties as a private, let make this property as private. If you make this property as private, then also it is not going to be available from outside the class. See, as soon as I make that property as private, I'm getting this error. What it means? Now it means any members, whether it is a property, variable, or it's a method, if you make that as private, it is not going to be available outside the class. Right? Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay. Now, so this is the example of a read write. And now let us understand some example of a read only and write only properties. So this is one of the example. So in this example, what I'm doing, I'm creating one calculator class to perform the addition, subtraction, multiplication, division operation. And for that, what I need, and whenever I want to perform the operation, I need 2 data, right? Number 1 and number 2. And I want to return, and for that I'm using this result variable. So you can see here I'm using setter as the set number as the set accessor, set number 2 as the set accessor. Here you can see For this number one, I'm using this property, right? For the number one variable, I'm using this set number property. And you can see here, it is having only the set accessor. See, the property name, you can give anything, but the data type should be same. Here the data type is, and here the data type is in. And for number two, I'm only having the set accessor, means it's a read-only property or write-only property. Having set accessor only means it's a read-only property or write-only.
Right only.
Write-only property. That means using this property, you can only set the data into this variable. You cannot get the data of this variable, right? And coming to this get result property. So this get result property, it's having only get accessor, means it's a read-only property. Using this property, you cannot set the data. You can only get the data. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay, and then I'm having four public methods: add, sub, mol, and division. And what I'm doing now, I'm just adding the two properties, and this number one and number two, and returning the result. Same in the case of sub and multiplication and division, right? Logic is no need to explain because this is very straightforward. So here, what I'm doing now, I'm just creating an instance of the calculator class. This is my calculator class. So I'm creating instance. Then I'm asking the user to please enter two numbers. And as we know, by default, whenever we enter anything from the keyboard, so it will be treated as a string. So, and I want to store that. Inside the set number one. Set number one is used for what variable? Underscore number one. So if you want to store that underscore number one, then that data type is int. So I'm using this integer.parse. Other options are also available. What are the options? Converted to int. So converted to int you can use, integer parse you can also use. Right? So once I set the number one and the number two, so then I'm just calling the add method. So once I call the add method, so this statement is going to be executed. So whatever number we have stored, that will be stored inside this result variable. And whenever I call get result property on this calculator instance, so whatever value stored inside this inside this result variable will be returned, because get result is a read-only property, right? The same case in the case of sub, and in the case of mol, and in the case of a div. So every time we call the method, they will do their respective operation, and whatever the result is for there, that result will be stored inside this result variable. And whenever we call the get result method, that get result method will return the value that is stored in the result variable. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay, now let's run the application. See, I'm entering two numbers. I'm entering 25 and I'm entering 15, and I press enter. See, the sum is 40, the sum is 10, mol is 375, and division is 1. So in our example, in this case, this set number and set number two, these two are having only write-only properties because they are having only set, and this is your read-only properties because it is only having the get accessor. Is that clear? What is read-only and what is write-only properties? Yes or no? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And one more thing, guys, even if you make the property as a private, then also it will become, suppose here what I'm doing, I'll come to that part. I'm just making that private get, right? And what I'm doing, I'm making this as private set. See, once you make the property as private, once you make the sector as private, means you cannot access this one. Here you have made this private get. Get means you cannot access the set number value, right? Even you are having the two properties, right? In this case, this is having both getter and setter. Even though both are having getter and setter, it will work like a write-only property. Why? Because you are making the get property as a private. Whenever this property is public, this property is public for this set accessor. But explicitly you are making that get as private, means you cannot access the get accessor of this property. See, so which one we make get? We make set number one. So if you try to write here, okay. If you try to write like this, you will get some error. Integer result. So you will get some error. Why it is? What error it is saying? The property or indexer cannot be used in this content because the get accessor is inaccessible. Right? So you can see the get accessor is inaccessible. Why? Because we make that accessor, that get accessor as private. So you can also make a property read only and write only by making the other property as private. In this case, if you make the set accessor as private, means it's a read only property. In this case, if you make the get accessor as private, means it's a write only property. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay. Now, what are the advantages? Property will provide abstraction to the data build. They also provide security to the data build. Properties can also validate the data before storing the data. We'll discuss this at the end of this session with one example so that you will understand what is the OOPS, how the OOPS concept and how the encapsulation principle we achieve using property and how we'll get all this benefit using properties. I will show you with one example now. Before that, we need to understand what are default accessibility specifier of an accessor. See, this is a property. This property having two accessor, one is set accessor and one is get accessor. Then what is the default accessibility specifier? Right? So whenever I'm saying accessibility specifier, you need to understand the private, public, protected internet, protected internal, all these things. Then by default, what is? Then by default, this set accessor is going to public or private or protected or internal or protected internal. What is? So that basically depend on the variable, depend on the properties access specifier. Right? In this case, this property employee ID access specifier is public. Public means by default, these two are going to be public. If this access specifier is private, then by default, these two are going to be private. Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
The previous, in this case, we are explicitly declaring private. Once you explicitly make it is private, it means it's a private. But if you remove this one, then it is going to be the same accessibility specifier of the property accessibility specifier. The property accessibility specifier is public means it is going to be by default public. By default public, but you can make it as protected, you can make it as a public, you can make it as private explicitly, no issue. But if you have not specified anything, then the default accessibility will be applicable. And what is the default accessibility? It is same as the property access specifier. If the property access specifier is public means this is public set, this is public get. If it is private means it is private set and it is private get. Is that clear? Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Then another thing is that so sometimes in the interview, that is not important, but sometimes in the interview, they just ask you this question: what are symmetric and asymmetric accessors? Right? The symmetric and asymmetric accessor means, see, let us read the definition. If the access specifier of the accessor, both get and set, are the same within a property accessibility specifier, then the accessor are known as symmetric. On the other hand, if the accessibility specifier of the accessor is not same within a property accessibility specifier, then the accessor is known as asymmetric. In this case, this property access specifier is what this set is protected, and this get is protected or public. Hello, guys, please do participate.
Protected.
This set is protected, and what is the accessibility specifier of get?
Public.
Public.
Public. Then protected and public both are same or different?
Different.
Different means they are asymmetric, right? And if I remove this one, then both are having same access specifier or not?
Yes.
Yes.
when they are having same means they are symmetric, and if the access specifier is different, then they are asymmetric. And we can also write the read-only properties using two access specifier. We have already discussed this. If you make the set as private, then it is going to be a read-only property, and if you make the get property as get accessor as private, then it is going to be write-only property. The point that you need to remember is once you declare the accessor as private, then you cannot access that accessor from outside the class. Okay. So what we discussed and what now we are going to discuss is something interesting, and you have to understand. If anybody working in industry, then they might not use this thing. They might not use like this, right? They don't create the variable like this. They don't use the properties like this. What they use, they are going to use something called auto-implemented properties, right? The auto-implemented properties basically introduced as part of CSharp 3.0. And if you do not have any additional logic while setting and getting the data from a data field, then you can go with auto-implemented property. In this case, only setting the property and getting the property. So there is no additional logic. So when there is no additional logic in the sense some validation logic, right? If there is no validation logic, only the basic logic to set and get the data, then instead of creating the variable like this, what you can go with auto implemented properties, right? So if you do not have any additional logic while setting and getting the data from a data field, that is from a variable of a class, then you can make use of the auto implemented properties which was introduced as part of CSharp 3.0. The auto implemented property in CSharp reduces the amount of code that you have to write. When we use auto implemented properties, then the CSharp compiler implicitly create private anonymous field or variable for that property behind the scene, which is going to hold the data. Okay. So what is the syntax? Access specifier, data type, property name. Example, public integer age. Okay. Let us see one example, and through the example, I will make you understand what is the advantages and what is the use of auto implemented properties. So in this case, I'm directly creating the properties like this. I have not written any logic to get the value or set the value, right? So these are default. Default means automatically in our previous example, what logic we have written, right, for setting and getting the data, that logic is not written here. Yes or no? Did we have write any logic to set the value to a variable or to get the value from a variable? Did we have write anything here? No.
No.
And second thing, did we have any variable declared inside the class?
No.
Then you might have one question. Sir, in the beginning, you only told me, Oscar, variable is only going to hold the data, right? Properties, properties are basically used to set or get the data from or to a variable. But in this case, we are not creating any variable. We are not writing any logic to set or get the data. Then how it is going to work? Yes or no? You have this question on your mind or not?
Yes, correct.
Yes. So what you need to understand, whenever you do not have any additional logic to set or get the data, you have to use these auto implemented properties. These are nothing but your auto implemented properties. There is no additional logic to set or get the data. So whenever you use auto implemented properties, then behind the scene, compiler will automatically create private anonymous variables for each of these properties. For ID properties, compiler will create internally one variable to hold the ID value. Compiler will create another compiler will also create a private anonymous field of integer type to hold the age value. Compiler will create a field or variable name to hold the name value. Compiler will create those variables internally, right? Compiler will internally manage those things. And whenever we are not writing any additional logic, If you are not writing any additional logic, the default logic is there, right? What is the default logic means? This compiler will create this property, compiler will create a variable for this property, right? So this get is basically used to get the data from that variable. This set is to get the data from that set variable, right? That means what? Now we are having 4 properties, but behind the scene, 4 variables will be created by the compiler. Those 4 variables are private type variables, and those variables are going to hold the data actually. And these are ID, name, age, and address are basically used to set and get the data from those internally created variable, which is created by the compiler. Now, to make you understand, let's run this application first. See, you are getting the data or not? Right. That means somewhere the data is stored, and as per our discussion, variables are only going to store the data. Then now you might be one question, sir, can you prove this? Variables are created behind the scene. Yes, we can prove this. How? Let's go to the so whenever we compile this code, the intermediate language is created by the language compiler. Yes or no? That intermediate language I can show you, and I will show you that variables are created for these properties. See, let us go to the folder where this is created. So it is created in this folder location. The exe file is created inside this folder location. Just copy the URL path. Okay. Open your developer command prompt. So which version of Visual Studio you install, there you will find something called developer command prompt for Visual Studio, right? So once you open this, so just type ILDASM, intermediate language disassembler. Once you press enter, this window will open, right? And from this open file open, and just provide the location, right? And once you provide this location, it will take you to the exe generated file location. Select the exe and click on the open button, right? Once you click on the open button, you will see that your class having 2 classes, your program having 2 classes. One is program class, one is employee class, right? You can see this is your program class, this is your employee class, and this is your program class. So where we have created the properties, we have created the properties inside the employee class. Just expand. So click on this plus button, it will expand. So you can see you are having these 4 properties: address, age, ID, and name. These 4 are nothing but your properties, right? And you can see for each properties there is something called get accessor and set. Get address, get age, get ID, get name. Set address, set age, set ID, set name. Apart from this, these 8 things you have written in your code, right? These are property, this getter and setter, right? So this thing you have written, but behind the scene, just check. For the address property, there is a private string field or not. For the age property, there is a field age with a private int 32 or not. For the ID, there is a private int 32 field or not. For the name, there is a private string name field or not. These fields are nothing but, which you can see from this to this, 4 fields are nothing but 4 variables, which is created by the compiler for these 4 properties. Is that clear?
Yes.
Yes.
So these variables are going to hold the data. You can see, you can check what is the address. Address is a string type. So you can see address is private string, right? This is public address, but while creating the variable, it is making that as private string. And you can see age private int 32. This ID private int 32. Name private string. That means these variables are created as a private or not?
Yes.
So,
but why they are private?
Because see, why they're private means you cannot access those variables from outside the class. If we are accessing the variables from outside the class, then why we are going to use these properties? We can create the variables public now. If we make them as public, you can access them directly from outside the class. For example, suppose I'm creating one public variable here, public integer. Let's say I'm making this as ID. So if I'm making this as a public, then there is no need for this public properties. Why? Now I can even access this directly now.
Correct.
Right? You can access this directly, but this is the data member. This data member is going to hold the data. As this data member is going to hold the data, we cannot take a chance. We cannot take that responsibility to provide a direct access to this data member from outside the class. Why I'm not going to provide direct access? That we will see after some time. But for now, you just understand, if you are using the auto-implemented properties, behind the scene, private variables are created by the compiler. Those private variables are actually going to hold the data. Right? Whenever you are setting the ID properties, then the private variable which is created for the ID properties is going to hold the value 101. Is that clear?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Right? Auto-implemented properties you can get. Okay. Now we will understand this with one real-time example. Right? Declaring the class field or variable as public and exposing those fields or variable to the outside world is bad, as we do not have any control over what get assigned and what get returned. Okay, let me open this. Okay, okay. See, in this example, I'm not using any properties. I'm just using the private. I'm just using the variables, and you can see I'm making the variable as public. So as we make the variables as a public, you can access those variables directly from outside the class or not?
Possible.
Possible, yes. So, but while you are getting and setting the data, right, you can set and get whatever you want. ID, you can pass a negative number. Name, you can pass a null number. Passmark, you are setting the value as 0. Right or not? That means whatever value, do you have any control what you need to set? No, you are giving the access to the outside class, right? So this is the class and he is giving access to the program class. Program class is outsider for the student class. And the program class means outsider. Outsider can have full control over the properties, right? Full control means whatever value he want, he can set. But our requirement is that ID should not be a negative number. Name should not be null. If name is null, then it should return me no name. And passmark, I should not set the passmark value. Right? Passmark should be a read-only property. I should not have to set the passmark value. But in this case, I can read and write, and whatever value I am passing, and whatever value I can return it. Yes or no? Because I am fully control over the data member. This is bad. Because you can see now your business requirement that you should not accept negative values for the ID. You should not accept value for passmark. Passmark should be read only. You should not have you should not set the value for the passmark. Can you do this using these public properties? No, because you cannot have control to them. You cannot control them. You are making them as public means outsider can control. Outsider have fully control over what they need to set and what need to get. Now, if I run this application, you will see that we are getting the output. Okay, so it will not run. We need to close this one. Okay. See, ID is -100, name is empty, passmark is 0. So this is not our requirement. Our requirement is ID value should always be a non-negative number. The name cannot be set to null. If a student name is missing, then we should return no name. The passmark value should always be read only. Right? This is our business requirement. And if we are making the variables as public, then we cannot implement or we cannot achieve this business requirement. Is that clear?
Yes.
Yes or no? Right.
Yes.
So properties are introduced in CSharp 3.0. Before CSharp 3.0, then how we are achieving this? Properties concept is not available in other programming languages like C++ and Java. Then how do they implement this concept? Right? That we need to understand. So in previous programming language, in other programming languages like C++ and Java, right? They are something called setter and getter methods. So what they generally do is they generally make the data member as private And for each data member, they create a pair of public setter and getter methods. And as part of the setter and getter method, they write the required logic, right, to validate the data before returning and before setting the value, right? Let's see this practically. So here I'm not going to use the properties. Think that this is other programming languages like C++ or Java. And in those programming languages, how did they implement this validation part by using setter and getter method? So you can see this is ID. ID means it's a private variable. Now I'm making all these variables as a private. So you cannot return, you cannot access those variables, right? And now I'm making one pair of setter and getter method for this ID property. If ID is less than 0, then ID value should be greater than 0, right? If ID is less than equals to 0, then I'm providing one option, ID value should be greater than 0, right? If ID value is greater than 0, then this statement will not be executed and it will set this ID property. Get ID means whatever value stored in the ID variable that will be written. Set name. Set name means here it is saying if we are setting some null or empty. Previously we have discussed the string class, and I told you the string class having many methods, right? As we progress, we will discuss one by one. So this is null or empty method. This method available in string class. So this method will check whether the name variable what you are passing is null or empty. If the value what the name variable hold is null or empty, then it will return true. And once it return true, it will execute this body, right? So once it execute, what it will do, it will throw an exception. Name should not be empty. If name is not empty, then it will set the name value inside this name variable. Then get name method. So again, if name is null or empty, so what I'm going to return, I'm going to return no name. And if the name having some value, then whatever value the name variable hold, that we will return. And get pass mark. And you can see for the pass mark, we are only having the get accessor. We do not have any set accessor. That means what? Now we cannot set the pass mark value. It's a read only properties. And whatever value this pass mark is holding, that is 35, will be returned. Now from the application, we are using the set name method and set ID method to set the name and ID. But we do not have any set pass mark method, right? So you cannot set the pass mark. Now if you run the application, you will see the output as expected. Yes or no? Yes. Now let's try to pass this set ID as a negative number and see what happens. So once you pass negative number, then you will see that one runtime error. So ID value should be greater than 0. What message we are giving, that will be printed. As of now, we have not implementing the exception handling mechanism. Once we implement the exception handling mechanism, then that message will be shown that please pass ID value as a non-negative number, right? So you can achieve this law validation. Validation means if you want to do some kind of operation before setting and getting the value, then you can do with the setter and getter methods. With the variables, you do not have logic to set and get the method. Because see, if you want to write some logic, for writing the logic, you need a method, right? And these are variables, they are not method, they are not having any block where you can write the logic. But if you are using properties or if you are using setter and getter methods, then they are special methods. So these are methods. Now I will show you the same example using the public, using the properties. So we will do the same validation and using the properties. In this example, we are using setter and getter methods. But setter and getter methods is used by C++ or Java programmers, but not used by .NET programmers, because in .NET framework we are provided with properties, right? Let's see how we can implement. See, this is the public ID properties. This is set accessor, and here I'm checking the value, right? So here I'm checking the set accessor. Previously we have not written this logic. We have simply written this one, but now we are writing this logic, right? Previously we have not written this logic while setting the value, but now we are writing this logic. In previously we have just written name. Now So we are having this logic. Now you can see here I'm using one operator called ternary operator. So this method will return true or false. Once it return true, then this statement will be going to execute it. And if this statement returns false, then this statement is going to be executed, right? If name is empty or null, then no name will be written. If name having some value, then that value will be written. And you can see this pass mark having only get accessor. So you cannot have set accessor. Now you are setting the value like this. So now if you run the application, you will get the output as expected. Right? Now if I pass this as a null value, then see what happened. Right? Null value. So what happened? See, we are getting an exception. Suppose I'm not setting the null, I'm not setting this properties value, right? And I'm trying to access the name property, right? So in this case, while you are trying to access the name property, so what it will return? Can anybody tell me? Guys? Hello? Guys?
Yes, sir.
So in this case, I'm not setting the name property, right? And while I'm accessing the name property, student.name, then what it will print here?
No name.
Yes, no name. Why? Because now by default name is a string type. As it is a string type, the default value for the string is null. And as we are not setting any value, that means the name is holding null value. And in this case, this statement will be true, right? Because name is null, so it will return true. In the case of true, it will return no name. Now, if you run the application, you will see that no name is returned, right? So this validation, what we are implementing is only using properties. This validation you cannot implement using so-called data members, right? So using properties, we can have fully control. We can have control what we need to get and what we need to set, whether we need to set or whether we need to get, right? That validation part is achieved by using properties.